All right, let's take a look at section 5. Here is the focus question. Americans in this period, in a world in which only a few European governments extended universal male suffrage, saw their nation as a beacon of democracy. Yet the power of corporations, which seemed removed from democratic controls, raised unsettling questions for Americans' belief that political freedom meant popular self government. Political corruption was pervasive. New railroad corporations wielded great influence in state legislatures, and often legislators in the West held stock or directed mining and lumber companies. Urban politics was often dominated by corrupt political machines, such as the Tweed Ring in New York, led by boss William M. Tweed, which both robbed the city of millions of dollars and built alliances with businessmen and labor, and also provided aid to the urban poor and unemployed. In national politics, many lawmakers supported bills benefiting companies in which they had invested or from which they received stock or salaries. The most famous case of corruption unfolded during the Grant administration. In the Credit Mobilier scandal, a corporation formed by Union Pacific Railroad stockholders made contracts with itself at government expense and for huge profits and gave stock to influential politicians. And the whiskey ring in the Grant administration united Republican officials, tax collectors, and whiskey makers in a scheme that defrauded the federal government of millions in tax dollars. The Civil War's legacy powerfully shaped national politics and elections. Republicans found support in the North, Midwest, and agrarian West, and among members of revivalist churches, Protestant immigrants, and blacks. Union veterans organizations were a strong Republican base. By the 1890s, pensions for Union soldiers and their widows and children were the largest item in the federal budget. After 1877, Democrats dominated the South and found support among Catholics, especially Irish Americans, in cities. The parties were closely divided. In most presidential elections between 1876 and 1892, the margin separating the major candidates was less than 1% of the popular vote. In 1874, Democrats won control of the House of Representatives, which started a period of political stalemate in which little new legislation was passed for 20 years. Only briefly did either party control both the Congress and the White House. One-term presidents followed: Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876, James A. Garfield in 1881, succeeded by Chester A. Arthur after Garfield was assassinated that year, Grover Cleveland in 1884, Benjamin Harrison in 1888, Cleveland again in 1892. American politics, with high numbers of eligible voters voting and contested elections, seemed healthy in a number of ways. Yet the political structure could not effectively confront rapid growth and economic transformation. The federal government remained small and had limited regulatory power compared to today. Both parties became controlled by party managers closely aligned with business interests. Republicans supported a high tariff to protect American industry and pursued a fiscal policy based on reducing spending, paying off the nation's debt, and withdrawing from circulation all greenbacks, the paper money issued during the Civil War. The Democrats opposed a high tariff, but because the leadership was still tied to New York banks and finance, they opposed demands from their agricultural base for an increase in the money supply. In 1879, the United States returned to the gold standard. Paper currency could again be exchanged for gold at a fixed rate. Republican economic policies, which reduced foreign competition in manufacturing and left it to the banks, not the government, to regulate the money supply, favored Eastern industrialists and bankers and disadvantaged Southern and Western farmers, who had to pay high prices for factory goods while prices for their crops dropped. There were a few reforms in the Gilded Age. In 1883, the Civil Service Act instituted a merit system for federal employees, which replaced political appointments with competitive examinations. In 1887, responding to protests against unfair railroad practices, Congress created the Interstate Commerce Commission to ensure that rates charged to farmers and merchants were reasonable. The ICC was the first federal agency to regulate the economy, but it could not itself set rates, and thus had little effect. Though Congress soon passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which banned combinations and practices restraining free trade, its language was too vague for its laws to be enforced, and the courts primarily used it as a way to suppress labor unions. These laws helped set the precedent that the national government could regulate the economy to promote the public good. Though national politics offered few solutions to economic problems, politics was vibrant and fluid at the state and local levels. After the Civil War, northern state governments expanded their role in the economy by launching public works programs that created jobs, and they assumed more responsibility for public health, education, and welfare. Third parties experienced some success. The Greenback Labor Party, which proposed that the federal government keep greenbacks in circulation, thus leaving money for investment and giving the government control over the money supply, led some local governments in the 1870s. Protests over railroad policies among farmers and local merchants suffering very high freight rates led to the formation of the Patrons of Husbandry, known as the Grange. Founded in 1867, the Grange established cooperatives for storing and marketing farm goods in order to force railroads to lower their prices. In some states, the Grange pressured state legislatures to investigate railroad rates and, in some cases, regulate them. A resurgent labor movement also called for economic regulation in the form of 8-hour laws limiting the workday. Although a few state legislatures passed these laws, they lacked means of enforcement and had little effect. But the efforts of farmers and workers to use the power of the state to counteract the inequalities of the Gilded Age inspired debate on the relationship between political and economic freedom in an industrial society. So that's the end of section 5. We'll see you for the next chapter.